record these sessions, and you will be able to see them on our YouTube channel. So welcome everyone. My name's Scott Miller, and I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. Like I said, I'm going to be your host tonight. Let's go ahead and dive right into our agenda for this evening for our free prep hour. So what we are going to do this evening, and actually before we get started, I want to share a little bit of information with you that might be helpful. If you are interested, you know, the free prep hour is not the only thing that we offer in terms of free resources for people who are preparing for the LSAT. We actually have a pretty good collection of free resources on our website. So I just put a link in the chat window to the free resource on our free resources on our website if you're interested in taking a look at those later on. So in terms of particularly what we were doing tonight, what we're going to do in this free prep hour, we're going to talk about arguments and debating arguments, which is a really significant part of your success on the LSAT, is your ability to understand arguments and debate arguments. We'll try to leave some time at the end for a Q&A, so if anyone has any questions at the end, or if anybody puts any questions in that Q&A window, I will do my best to answer those and spend a little time at the end of the session answering those. So that's our agenda for this evening. Just a couple quick facts about arguments. So 80% of all logical reasoning questions, and I mentioned this if you attended our free prep hour last time, 80% of all logical reasoning questions in one way or another require you to understand the components of an argument, understand what arguments are all about, and be able to break an argument down into its components. So because there are two scored LR sections on every LSAT, that means that 80% of LR questions ends up being, 40% of your total complete LSAT score. So I'm not going to go too much into the basics of arguments and what an argument is and how an argument works and all that stuff. And just, I'm curious, how many people, because I know sometimes people log in, with different names and stuff like that. Was anybody here? Let me know in the chat window. Give me a yes in the chat window if you were here for our last free prep hour, our last LSAT free prep hour on July 2nd, or if you've seen that video. Give me a yes in the chat window if you've seen either of those. Okay, looks like we have some new people. Fantastic. So let's, the point I was making a moment ago is if you, like I said, I'm not going to get too far into what an argument is or like the basics of arguments. We did that last time on July 2nd. So if you are interested in that, I would recommend you go to our YouTube channel. If you want to find our YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and do a search for Manhattan Prep Free LSAT Hour, and that will bring you to our free prep hour from July 2nd. And this is where I spent a good amount of time in the beginning talking about arguments. What is an argument? And how do arguments actually work specific to the LSAT, right? Because everything we're talking about here is specific to the LSAT. There are different types of arguments you can run into, in everyday conversation, or even if you're studying logic or philosophy, different types of arguments. But what we're talking about here are the types of arguments that are specifically found on the LSAT. So again, I suggest that if you want to review that, if you want to review some of the basics of arguments, check out our last free prep hour. In terms of today, just very quickly, so when we're talking about arguments on the LSAT, an argument on the LSAT, the types of arguments we're interested in on the LSAT consist of a premise and a conclusion. So the conclusion is the thing that someone is trying to convince you of, right? The whole purpose of an argument on the LSAT, the kind of arguments we talk about on the LSAT, the whole purpose of it is to convince you that this conclusion is true. So the conclusion tends to be, a claim, something, subjective, something that may or may not be true. And the thing that makes this an argument, in order for us to have an argument, we can't just have a claim. In fact, a claim by itself isn't even a conclusion. We couldn't even call that a conclusion. In order for this claim to be a conclusion, in order for us to have an argument, we also have to have support. We have to have a premise. So if I say, you know, everyone should read Hanu Rajamani's stories, that's an opinion. But if I say, oh, he's an amazing science fiction author, therefore everyone should read his stories, that is an argument, right? I'm giving you some kind of support, some kind of reasoning behind my claim that I'm making. So what we're talking about tonight is not necessarily just the structure of arguments. We will talk a lot about the structure of arguments and how to break an argument down into its component parts. But what we're focusing more on is how to debate arguments. So how would we debate this argument? If I made this argument to you, Hanu Rajnemi is an amazing science fiction author. Therefore, everyone should read his stories. How would you debate this? How would you disagree with me if you wanted to, you know, knock my argument down? If we were having a good old-fashioned debate about this, what would you say to if you were going to disagree, debate my argument? And if you want to, in the chat window, if you have any ideas, go ahead and put them in the chat window. Yeah, why would everyone like science fiction? Because science fiction is awesome, Christina. That's why. But so that's a really good point, right? That's a good way to debate this argument. You know, so well, he's a science fiction author, but what if I don't like science fiction? You know, maybe there are actually, it seems strange to me, but maybe there are actually people out there who don't like science fiction. So that would call into question our conclusion that everyone should read his stories. So another way you could debate the argument is simply say, well, you know, Scott, your premise here just sounds like your opinion too, right? He's an amazing science fiction writer. What do you mean amazing? Like define amazing. It's your opinion, isn't it? So what we're more likely to see on the LSAT is a premise that is more factual. This is what you're more likely to encounter on the LSAT. A premise that says something like, he's an award-winning science fiction author. So premises do tend to, not always, it's not guaranteed, but premises on the LSAT tend to be factual. If I'm going to try to convince you that my opinion is true, then I'm not going to give you another opinion to try to convince you of that. I'm probably going to give you a fact. And so this is good news, because what it means is we never have to worry about questioning a premise. Just generally on the LSAT, you know, if we say, hey, this guy is an award-winning science fiction author, you don't actually have to know that he is or is not an award-winning science fiction author. We're just going to accept this as a fact. I accept your premise. Yes, I accept what you're saying about this author, that he has in fact won at least one award. So what we're always debating when we talk about debating arguments on the LSAT, what we're always debating is the connection between the premise and the conclusion, whether or not this premise actually supports the conclusion that everyone should read his stories. And Christina, you know, you came up with a really good point is, you know, he's a science fiction author. What if I don't like science fiction? You know, Christina, you are included in everyone in my conclusion, right? You're part of everyone. So what if some of these everyone people don't like science fiction? That would shoot a hole in my argument. So this is always what we're looking to do when we're debating arguments on the LSAT. We're always looking to question the connection between premise and conclusion. We're going to accept a premise as true. We're not going to, you know, question whether or not he really is an award-winning author. Anything that if you identify something on the LSAT as a premise, there are some rare exceptions. I admit there are some rare exceptions, but for the most part, don't question the premise. And in fact, be on the lookout for answer choices that try to get you to do that, because they'll set traps for you that way. All right, excellent. So moving on from here, more specifically about how we debate arguments. Last time in the last free prep hour, if you go back and watch that July 2nd free prep hour, I talked about matching questions, those really long questions in logical reasoning that everyone loves to hate. And I talked about how these are actually really useful in terms of just learning to understand arguments better. Because, you know, you know, you probably recognize one of these if you've been preparing for the LSAT at all. You would probably recognize one of these questions if you saw it. These are the types of question stems that you'll see. Which of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning to the argument above? Which of the following uses flawed reasoning that most closely resembles the argument above? So the reason these are really useful to you in terms of exercising your argument skills is because if you look at this first question stem, it's saying which one of the following arguments is similar to the one above. And this is how these questions work. It's one of the reasons why they're difficult, but it's also one of the reasons why they can be useful, is because not only is, and this is blurred out intentionally. If you're looking at this and going, I can't read it, it's really blurry. I just did that so, because we're not going to try to answer this specific question right now. But what I want to point out is that in these questions, if you've seen this, if you've been looking at these already, you've seen this. Not only do I have an argument in the stimulus, but each answer choice is an argument in itself. So if you want to get some practice in understanding arguments on the LSAT, just grab a couple of these questions and read each piece, read the stimulus, read each answer choice, and try to do the things that we talk about tonight in this session in terms of identifying the components of the argument, identifying what the different pieces are, and then seeing how they fit together. And what you'll find along the way, I think, and this is what I was suggesting last time, is not only does this help you practice in your overall understanding of the argument, of what an argument is and how arguments work on the LSAT, it will also, at the same time, help you understand maybe how to answer these specific question types better. You'll start comparing these arguments and see how they're the same and how they're different. So one of the things that one of the overall themes, one of the big takeaways that I hope you'll leave this session with is on the LSAT, and it applies to these matching questions, it applies to every question that you run into on the LSAT. The key to success is working in a very methodical step-by-step process. Right? Step by step is the key to success. So one of my favorite, jokes I say all the time during LSAT classes and, when I'm tutoring students and stuff is, how do you eat an elephant? You guys have probably heard this one before, right? One bite at a time. So that's the way, I think this is one of the mistakes that people make in general on the LSAT, certainly in logical reasoning, but even in general on the LSAT. You try to do things in big chunks, right? So you'll read like the stimulus to a logical reasoning question, and you're trying to understand and absorb the whole thing in one big chunk. When really the most effective way to handle almost everything on the LSAT is to break it down into smaller pieces. Look for ways and find ways to break things down into smaller, more manageable pieces. And, so smaller steps can be done quickly. And it's a little bit easier to take a simple step and do it correctly and accurately than it is to take a big, giant, complex thing and try to do it correctly all at once. So that's one of the things I'd like you to notice during our session tonight, is notice the exact way that I'm encouraging you to break things down into smaller pieces. And because that's going to be, it applies so much to the logical reasoning section, but it applies to reading comprehension and logic games as well. So how do we do that? What do I mean by breaking things down piece by piece? So there's an overall process for logical reasoning that you should pay attention to. And the first step when you're approaching any logical reasoning question is to understand what your task is. And what that means is, it's very tempting, and a lot of people will do it this way. A lot of people, when they're seeing a logical reasoning question, the first thing they want to do is read the little paragraph they give you, the stimulus. But I always encourage you to read past the stimulus and look at the question stem first, because all these questions are going to ask you to do different things. And if you read the question stem, then you're going to understand exactly what your specific job is for this particular question. And then once you know that, so this is one of those matching questions, right? And not only are they asking you to match up the answer choice with the stimulus, but they're telling you right up front that the reasoning in the stimulus is flawed, that this is an argument that we're going to debate. We're going to read this argument and understand this argument and then try to debate the argument and find out why the reasoning is flawed, just like my little science fiction argument a moment ago. So once I know what my task is, once I know what my job is, now I can go ahead and read the stimulus. And in this type of question, as in 80% of the questions in logical reasoning, your job is first to understand the argument, to break the argument down into its component pieces. And we use a term, at Manhattan Prep, we use a term called the argument core. And what that means is taking a big, long paragraph like this and extracting from it the specific pieces that you want to pay attention to. With the core of the argument, the heart of the argument itself, meaning the premise and conclusion, right? Taking a long paragraph and being able to extract the premise and the conclusion. And I don't necessarily recommend that every time you do one of these questions, you write out the premise and the conclusion like this. This is more of a representation of what you want going on in your head and the understanding you have in your head. We just, in these sessions and in classes, we write it out like this to help you visualize it better and to understand what you want to be thinking as you read these arguments. So in order to do this, the first thing I'm going to do when I read a stimulus like this, when I read a paragraph like this, is, and you maybe with some arguments you just do this naturally, right? This is easy, but you should be able to do this for all the arguments that you read, whether it's an easy question or a hard question. This is going to be your goal. This is your objective. The thing that you're trying to understand and accomplish is to understand what are all, the first thing to understand the argument, you have to understand what all these individual statements are. Like, what are the individual pieces of information they're giving me? And this is one thing to work on. If you're having trouble in logical reasoning, one of the best things you can work on is being able to read these paragraphs and just break them down into individual ideas. So if you've been reading this, we have separate ideas here. We should accept the proposal to demolish the old train station. It's a single idea, concept by itself. We could put a period on the end of it, right? Because the local historical society, which vehemently opposed this, is dominated by people who have no commitment to long-term economic well-being. This is a totally different thought, a totally different idea about a different subject, different concept. So our first statement that we looked at was about accepting the proposal to demolish this train station. This is about the local historical society and their thoughts on the matter and who they are. Right? So totally separate idea, separate concept. And then we get another concept, another complete sentence about preserving old buildings. So, if you're going to have success in logical reasoning, you need to be able to do this. You need to, as you're reading, realize when you're getting to the end of an individual concept, an individual idea, an individual statement. And because this is how you're going to sort out the premises and conclusion in the argument. So in this case, we have a really good, and again, if you see our free prep hour from July 2nd, we talk about these keyword indicators, right? So because indicates a premise, indicates support. When I see this word because, that's telling me that it indicates to me that it's very likely that what I just read is the conclusion. And now they're giving me the support. Why should we accept the proposal to demolish the old train station? Why? Why do you want me to believe that? It sounds like your opinion. Oh, because of this. Here's my support. So now I'm kind of reading this next statement through that lens, that this is my premise. This is the support. So this first statement is the conclusion. And the second statement gives me premises, support. And I don't have to be sure of this as I'm reading. The first time I'm reading through this, I'll often just kind of guess. Like, I get an impression. I think this is the conclusion. Oh, yeah, look, it totally looks like a conclusion because this next thing looks like a premise. Well, now, what about this last thing? Preserving old buildings creates an impediment to new development, which is critical to economic health. Well, that sounds like another reason, more support for why we should demolish this poor old train station. So now my hypothesis here, my theory is that the first sentence is the conclusion, and these next two statements or the first statement is the conclusion. These next two statements are premises. And this is the way you read. As you're reading through the first time, you're just kind of guessing, what do I think these things are? Trying to see what the different pieces are. Really just trying to identify what the pieces are. And I never worry about debating an argument. I never worry about what I'm supposed to do with the argument until I know what the argument is. So now that I understand, and I may read through this one time and then just check it again to be sure. Yeah, this all sounds good. This certainly sounds like the conclusion, and these next two statements sound like my premises. So now, once I've done this, now I can debate the argument. If I'm being asked about a flaw in the argument, now I can say, all right, what's wrong with this argument? And I'm curious, anybody in the chat window want to, I'll give everybody a moment to look at this. If you're watching at home, maybe write a couple notes to yourself on paper. How would you debate this argument? What's wrong with this argument? Do you see anything wrong with it? And if you want to, in the chat window, give me your thoughts about what's wrong with this argument. Why is this not a good argument? Why is this a flawed argument? They told us it was a flawed argument. You remember a moment ago when we looked at that, the question step. So what's wrong with it? It's okay to guess. And by the way, any answers that you put in chat are not going to appear in the video on YouTube. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't want people to see what my guess is, just don't worry about it. They're not going to see it. And we're all here learning. So yeah, the premise is not related to the conclusion. So you're correct. I mean, well, I don't know. I would say they are related. I'd say they're related. That sounds kind of strong to me, right? There is a relationship here, because we should accept the proposal to demolish the old train station. Well, what is it that the local historical society is opposing? I think they're opposing the proposal. So there's a relationship. There is a relationship. But what's wrong with the relationship? How are we supposed to know if the people who oppose are really committed to long-term, have no commitment to long-term economic well-being? So that's a really good question, Nicole. And what I would say is, again, I mentioned this earlier, the LSAT is not going to test your ability to know whether facts are true or not. So, if you identify this statement as the support for the conclusion, if you would agree with me, Nicole, that this sounds like this is support, and you're saying, well, do I believe the support? Do I believe the evidence is true? On the LSAT, the answer is yes, because generally, with very, very few exceptions, they're not testing your ability to debate the argument or not. They're not testing your ability to debate the premise. What they're testing is whether or not this premise supports the conclusion. So you can always focus your attention on whether you can accept the premises as fact and focus your attention on whether the premises support the conclusion or not. So I'm looking at it. The premise appears to be an assumption. Okay, so what I'm seeing here is a lot of you guys are focusing on, and this is totally natural. This is very, very a very natural thing to do, because this is a lot of times what we would do in, if you're in a philosophy class, if you're at a debate club, very often, or just, in everyday conversation, we question whether or not the premises are correct. And I'm just going to tell you on the LSAT's not testing your ability to do that. The LSAT is not testing your ability to look at this and say, oh, that sounds like somebody's opinion. It's being given in support of this. So I'm gonna just show you a different kind of approach. I mean, in everyday conversation, some of that would be good, but in the LSAT, we want to focus on the link. So what led them, why only focus on the opposing side and not the proposal? Now, that's a statement that's the kind of thinking that we want to do on the LSAT, right? Why are we focusing on the opposing side? Notice what they're saying. The local historical society opposes this. But what are they telling us about the local historical society? They're dominated by people who have no commitment to long-term economic well-being. So they're telling me something about the type of people who are on this board. So, and notice what my conclusion is saying. We should demolish the station. We should accept the proposal to demolish the station. Why should we do this? Because, the local historical society is just a bunch of old sticks in the mud, right? The local historical society is, they have no commitment to long-term economic well-being. And if we preserve these old buildings, then that's going to harm our economic health, right? So this is called, has anybody ever heard of an ad hominem argument? if you've heard of an ad hominem argument, that's what this is. That's one of the problems with this argument is they're attacking the people making the argument, and they're not attacking the argument. It's they're not attacking the merits of what the people are saying. They don't tell us anything about what the people on the historical society are actually saying. All they're telling us is that they're, dominated by people who have no commitment to economic well-being. But what if they're right? Well, what are their arguments, right? What arguments are the local historical society making? We aren't told anything about that. So anytime you attack the person making the claim and not the claim itself, that's flawed reasoning. And the LSAT will, every once in a while, will do that. Or they'll test your ability to recognize it. So, like, for example, if, I don't know, maybe you have like a relative, brother-in-law, cousin, something like that, who's a real hoodlum, right? Joe's been in jail a bunch of times. And Joe, sends you a text message and says, hey, your house is on fire. Get out of the house. And you go, oh no, Joe is a hoodlum. Joe is, he's been in jail a bunch of times. I'm not going to believe anything he says. He always lies to me. Well, you're attacking the person and maybe not considering that they're actually standing outside of your house watching the roof burn, and they really are telling you to get out of the house, right? So we can't, just because we know something about these people and what they think, but we're not told anything about what their actual argument, what their actual, statements are. Why do they feel this way? We can't say that we should then accept the proposal. So that's one problem. We have a problem with you're attacking the people making the opposing statement and not actually attacking the opposing statement itself. We don't even know what their opposing statement is or why they're opposed to it. So another problem is that with this argument is preserving old building creates an impediment to new development, which is critical to economic health. Well, how do we know that economic health is more important than this train station? Maybe this train station is, historic. Maybe this train station is, it was built by somebody who, I don't know, became president or something like that. Like maybe there's a reason to preserve this train station that has nothing to do with economic development. So notice that all of the arguments that are given, even if we go back to this like ad hominem argument, we're calling it, the worrying about the character of the local historical society and what kind of people are on it, it's still all about economic reasons. And there could be some other reason to demolish, why we don't want to demolish the train station. So we're only given a very limited number of reasons, and we're not considering what other reasons there could be. We haven't even heard from the historical society and what they think. We just know they're a bunch of old sticks in the mud. All right, so and this is again, these are the steps that you want to follow when you're dealing with any type of, if you're dealing with any type of LSAT, LR question that has an argument in it, you need to understand what we call the argument core. You need to identify the argument core. You need to identify what the conclusions are and what the premises are. And then if you're being asked to, if you know that there's a problem with the argument, if they tell you it's a flawed argument, if they tell you you need to strengthen the argument, weaken the argument, identify an assumption in the argument, then this is what you need to do, is question not whether the premises are true, but question whether the premises actually support and fully do support the conclusion, which in this case they don't. All right. So now if we were actually doing this particular question, this is off the June 2007 test, which you can download from the LSAC website. This is section 3, question 20. So if we were actually going to go all the way through this question, I'm not going to go through all the answer choices, but I do want to look at a couple answer choices. Now that we've, evaluated the argument, we understand what the problem is. We understand that this is attacking the people making the argument and not really attacking their reasons for opposing. And then it's also focusing on this one thing, economic health, and not, other possible factors that should be considered. So now we're going to look at, for this particular question, we're going to look at the answer choices and try to find an answer choice that has two characteristics. At a minimum, we want to find an answer choice that has the same flaw, in it, right? The flawed reasoning exhibited by this argument is most similar to which one of the following arguments. So hopefully it's an argument with a similar structure, but the main thing we're looking for is that it has the same flaw. So I'm going to be let's look at a couple specific answer choices and how we would approach these. So if I look at, and I'm going to do these out of order, I picked these answer choices just to illustrate some specific points. So again, I'm going to look at each answer choice and I have to understand, like, what is the, what are the individual statements and what is the core of this argument? What are the premises and what are the conclusion? Because if I'm going to understand whether or not they have the same flaw, I have to understand the argument itself. So again, let me break this down into individual statements. And this, I think, is the way you should always read answer choices and arguments and the stimulus, the paragraphs in logical reasoning, one piece at a time, one bite at a time. So one should not borrow money, one should not borrow even small amounts of money unless it's absolutely necessary. That sounds like an opinion to me. I mean, maybe it's a fact. I don't know. I'm going to have to read the rest of this to know. Once one borrows a few dollars, the interest starts to accumulate. Okay, well, that sounds like a reason. That sounds like support for the idea that I shouldn't borrow even small amounts of money. The longer one takes to repay, the more one ends up owing. Oh yeah, that sounds like it's telling me why. And eventually a small debt has become a large one. So you see, if I break this down into individual pieces, I can see pretty quickly, if I consider each statement individually, if I read this whole thing all at once, it can be really hard to wrap your head around the argument. If I read each statement individually, it's a little easier to notice the connections between them. So it sounds to me like these latter three statements are all there to support the first sentence, the first statement, which is my conclusion. So now the next thing I think is, does this have the same argument as my stimulus? Or sorry, does this have the same flaw as my stimulus? Is this exhibiting the same flaw? And the answer is it's not, right? The flaw in this, does anybody see what the flaw is in answer choice E here? Does anybody see what's wrong with answer choice E and why it is a flawed argument? There are a couple things you might come up with, but I'm wondering if anybody sees a problem with this. Do these premises actually support the idea that you should never borrow even small amounts of money? It says should not, sure. Yeah, the conclusion, that's the conclusion. The conclusion is that you should not borrow even small amounts of money. That is my conclusion to this argument. But why, why do these premises not support that? My question is, if these are the premises, if this is the evidence, if these are the statements I'm trying to give you in support of the idea that you should not borrow even small amounts of money, why have I not convinced you? Why have I not convinced you that my conclusion up here is true? So if I look at the first one, once one borrows a few dollars, the interest rate starts to accumulate. I might look at that and say, and this is what we call the debater stance. Like, if you can come up with objections, if you can come up with an idea why, even if I accept this is true, okay, let me just accept this, that once I borrow a few dollars, the interest is going to start to, like, whoever I borrow money from is going to charge me interest. If I borrow money from my next door neighbor, he's going to charge me interest, right? So let me just accept that. But does that mean I shouldn't even borrow small amounts of money? I mean, how much interest? How much interest are we talking about? Are we talking about borrowing $100 and I have to, I get 10 cents in interest or 2 cents in interest? Yeah, so I like that. That's perfect. The longer one takes to repay, that's a big problem with this argument. How do we know that you're not going to pay it right back? So the longer one needs to repay, the more one ends up owing. So I can accept this. I don't have to question whether or not this is true. I can accept this statement. Yes, it is true. The longer one takes to repay, the more one ends up owing. So what if I repay it right away? Then I'm not going to end up owing much, right? And if I really want it to be, so right now, so notice how I've accepted this premise, but I'm not accepting the link between this premise. I'm not accepting the idea that this premise guarantees the conclusion, right? This premise doesn't necessarily guarantee the conclusion. So if I keep going here with this, And I look at the last one. I mean, if I look at the last one, and eventually a small debt has become a large one. When you're debating arguments, you don't have to be a nice person. If you're, I hope you're normally, you know, a nice person in everyday life. But when you're debating arguments on the LSAT, you can be a not nice person at all. So who says I'm going to pay it back? Eventually, a small debt has become a large one. So what? Maybe I'm not going to pay them back. Right? So you can see in several ways for each of these statements, we can see how each of these individual statements, if we think about it, we can come up with a reason why it doesn't actually guarantee this conclusion. It doesn't guarantee that my conclusion is true. And so that's why we say it's a flawed argument. All right, but the problem is that none of these flaws that we've come up with match the flaw that we were talking about. We're not saying that, you know, we're not attacking the person making these statements at all. We're considering the statements themselves and whether or not they support the conclusion. And it's not just saying there's one single factor to consider and there are other factors we might not be considering. They're actually giving us several reasons here. All right, so if we skip ahead a little bit and we look at answer choice C here, show you an example. So again, answer choice C, we want to start by, you know, looking at this answer choice, and don't just try to read the whole thing and absorb it all in your head. Read each statement one at a time and think about it. You should have your hair cut no more than once a month. That sounds like maybe a claim. I don't know. There's a should in there, right? After all, beauticians suggest that their customers have their hair cut twice a month. And they do this as a way of generating more business for themselves. So after all is, to me, an indicator of a premise. And on the LSAT, you'll see that a lot. Right? After all indicates that what follows is the reason why I want you to believe the conclusion. So notice, so beauticians suggest that their customers have their hair cut twice a month. Okay. Oh, and they do this as a way of generating more business for themselves. Well, maybe this is true. Maybe they are doing it as a way to generate more business for themselves, but maybe there are also good reasons. So maybe you should still have your hair cut no more than twice than you should have your hair cut. You should have your hair cut no more than once a month. Let me say that again a little more clearly. Beauticians suggest that their customers have their hair cut twice a month. Okay. And we're given like, oh, they have an ulterior motive for that. But maybe there also is a reason why you should have your hair cut twice a month. Maybe that's still a good idea, even though the person telling you this has, you know, maybe a little bit of a nefarious reason for telling you. So that doesn't mean that we should have our hair cut no more than once a month. That doesn't support our conclusion. So this is an example of an argument that's exhibiting the same flaw as our original argument. It's attacking the person making the claim and not really addressing the claim itself. Well, is there a reason? Are there other reasons why we should maybe have our hair cut twice a month? I mean, yeah, the people saying it, we can question why they're saying it, but maybe it's still correct. And so I can't conclude from that. You know, the LSAT's very literal, very absolute. You should have your hair cut no more than once a month. That's my conclusion. I'm trying to convince you that that is true. And simply the fact that one person who gives you alternate advice may have other reasons, you know, not very good reasons for doing it, or reasons that are not in your best interest, doesn't mean that it isn't true. All right, so that's how, and again, the big takeaway here is not so much like this one particular question, but think about the process that we're using, both the process that we use to analyze the original argument and the process that we use to analyze these answer choices. First, we need to break them down into individual statements. As you're reading these for the first time, don't just read through at high speed. You need to almost take a little pause, a little breath at the end of each individual statement and consider that statement. What's that thought? What does that seem to be to me? Is that a conclusion? Is that a premise? What is it? And then as you do this, as you read each statement and consider how it's related to the statement that you just read, from there you'll get an idea of the structure of the argument. What is the conclusion they're trying to convince me of, and what's the support for it? And I think it's really interesting because people will read over and over and over, like people will read a stimulus like this or an answer choice like this 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 times. Like people will spend literally 30 seconds reading one answer choice, just reading it all as one big piece, and they'll read it over and over and over again. And and it doesn't really dawn on you that you're doing anything wrong just by reading this over and over and over again. But if I ask you to read and pause after each statement and think about it, you think that I'm asking you to drive your car off a cliff, right? Because some of these things, when we talk about breaking things down step by step, it sounds like it's going to take so long, like, oh, you're asking me to do so many things. But really what we're suggesting is that you break very complicated things down into individual small steps that are easy to do quickly and easy to do correctly. And then you only have to do it once, right? There's another saying, not a very good piece of advice, but maybe you heard the saying, there's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it over. Anybody ever heard that? Right? It applies so much to the way people take the LSAT. People are willing to read things over and over and over again, rather than just slowing down a little bit and reading it effectively the first time. So, and maybe the question that we're looking at here, maybe these arguments you've been studying, maybe you've been studying for the LSAT for a while, and these arguments that we're looking at are relatively simple, which is great. But what I want you to think about is, I think the temptation is, you think if it's simple, you'll just, do it all at once. Oh, this is simple. I can just do it all. I don't have to follow these steps. I can just do it all in one piece and do it quickly. And then, oh yeah, okay, well, I guess if I run into something that's difficult, I'll, do things in a more step-by-step way. The problem is, how are you going to know that something is difficult in time? Are you going to wait until you've read it 3 or 4 times and like not figured it out and then go, oh yeah, this is really difficult. Maybe I better, slow down and do it in a more step-by-step way. It's wasting time. So honestly, when I talk about reading things in a very step-by-step manner, thinking about this in a very step-by-step manner, following these steps, I do it all the time. I do it on easy questions and I do it on hard questions. And I don't change the basic fundamental process. There's different approaches for different questions, of course. And I might do things a little bit differently on a difficult question than I do on an easier one. But the basic underlying process, the basic underlying steps are the same, whether you're doing or whether, I won't speak for you. I'll just speak for myself and give you and suggest that this is a good way to do it. The basic process I follow for a difficult question is the same as the one that I follow for an easy question. I'm still doing all these steps in an easier question. I just do them really fast. And if it really is an effective process, then it's not going to slow you down on an easy question, but it will help you deal with a more difficult question much more effectively. And that's the whole idea. You don't wait until you realize you're stuck in the mud and go, oh, wow, this is a difficult question. Let me back up and do this over again a better way. You want to just have a simple process that you follow over and over. And then, you'll recognize when things are a little more difficult and you have to think about it a little more. But the basic underlying process is still the same. All right, so let's look at another question. Let's look at applying some of these pieces that we've talked about and applying them to an entire question. So again, this is from the June 2007 test. This is section 2, question 6. And I'm just going to show you this question, and I will ask you to just work through it on your own. If you have a little piece of scrap paper with you, you can. What I actually think is a good idea is, if you're working on a question, and you're looking at it on the screen, just write A, B, C, D, E on the piece of paper so that you can cross things out and make a few notes as you're looking at answer choices. But I'm going to give you all a minute and a half or so to look at this question. And then I'm going to show you how to apply this same process that we've been talking about to cut this question down to size pretty quickly. So here you go. I'll give you a minute and 20 to try this on your own. All right, time's up, pencils down. That was 1:20. So let me show you how to apply these things that we're talking about to this specific question. We're going to start by, again, I always want to read my question stem. So this is a different type of question from the one we were just looking at. This is saying the argument's conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. Now, for a moment, we're not going to worry about what does that mean, follows logically. They're telling me there's an argument, and we're dealing with the conclusion of the argument, doing something with the conclusion of the argument, and we're being asked about an assumption in the argument. All right. So I know there's an argument, so I'm just going to follow those basic steps and find my argument core. If I'm going to figure out what's going on with the conclusion of the argument, I have to know what the conclusion is first. So let me do that. Let me find the argument core. So again, I'm going to read this piece by piece. An undergraduate degree is necessary for appointment to the executive board. Okay. I'm not sure what that is. So let me keep reading. And it's okay to say, oh, I don't know. I'm not going to pause here and read this 3 or 4 times trying to figure out, is that a premise? Is it a conclusion? I just read it. Okay, if I'm not sure, just keep moving, keep reading. Further, no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Okay, I'm still not sure where we're going with this. Thus, oh, okay, now I know. Thus, therefore, that word by itself tells me that what I'm about to read is going to be a conclusion based on these 2 statements. That's what thus means, therefore means in a sentence. Hence, so, when you see that on the LSAT, it means, hey, based on what I just told you, I want you to believe this next thing is true. So Murray, an accountant, bachelor's, master's degree, cannot be accepted. So oh boy, there's a whole lot of stuff here, right? So again, let me break this down piece by piece, one bite at a time. So Murray, an accountant with both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. Now, wait a minute, that sounds like a fact. That doesn't sound to me like, you're not saying, therefore Murray is an accountant with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. You're not trying to convince me that this is true. This sounds like a fact I'm supposed to accept. So let me just hold off on that for a second. This sounds to me like a premise. Murray, what else are we saying about Murray? Can't be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Oh, okay, well, that sounds more like a conclusion. Murray can't be accepted for the position of executive administrator. Well, why not? He has a felony conviction. Since, I think we talked about this earlier, the word since. Why? Why can't Murray be accepted for the position of the executive administrator? Oh, because he has a felony conviction. So again, reading this argument, I think could get kind of confusing if you didn't break it down piece by piece. Either, and maybe, so here's the thing, maybe you kind of intuitively understood the argument. Maybe you're even already seeing what's wrong with the argument without breaking it down like this. But what I'm going to suggest is if you do, just slow down a little bit, give yourself a couple extra seconds to actually understand the argument very thoroughly like this and to really be able to identify the pieces. What is the conclusion of this argument exactly? What are the facts, the evidence, the premises? The more clearly you understand that, the faster you can work and more accurately you can work through the answer choices. So, what have I been told? What are my facts? An undergraduate degree is necessary for an appointment to the executive board. And notice, I'm not going to question this fact. I don't know what executive board they're talking about. I don't know if an undergrad degree is necessary or not. I'm just going to accept that. If you have a felony conviction, you can't be appointed to the board. Okay, sure, I believe you. If you have a felony conviction, you can't be appointed to the board. Great. Murray who? What Murray are we talking about here? I don't know. I don't care. He has an undergraduate degree, but he also has a felony conviction. Notice I left out the master's degree. I'm leaving out a little piece here because my other premise says an undergrad degree is necessary. And if you don't, maybe you don't know undergrad, what does that mean? Maybe you're, if you're not from the US, maybe they don't use those exact same terms where you are, but we certainly know that Murray has a couple of degrees here, right? So again, the LSAT isn't testing my knowledge of degrees and executive boards here. All the information I need to answer this question is right here in front of me. And I can just read what's on the page and understand it. And all I have to do is say, what is similar? What pieces have they given me and what pieces are missing? So based on all this, and again, I'm using some of these keywords. Don't ignore these words if they're there. These are words that we read past very easily when we're reading Normally when you're reading stuff, an everyday, reading or academic reading, even you're reading for school, you're reading the news at home, words like thus, therefore, since, we tend to read right by them because we're focusing on the content. We're focusing on the details. And those words just kind of subconsciously tell our brain or give our brain some little pieces of information. On the LSAT, they are extremely important, right? Thus tells me that I'm transitioning from a premise to a conclusion. And in fact, further tells me that both of these statements are premises. If this, no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board, if that's a premise because thus tells me it's a premise, it tells me that from that I'm going to draw a conclusion, then further tells me that these two things are linked. It's like and tells me that they're both similar in similar parts of the argument, or the same type of part. They're both premises. So you want to pay attention to these words. If you're having trouble with arguments and you're having trouble figuring out, what's a conclusion? What are premises? What am I, which piece is which? You have trouble just identifying the parts the way of the argument core, the way we are here. See if you can pay more attention to these words, these indicator words that we have that tell us, hey, look here, this is probably your conclusion. Hey, look at this. This is probably a premise. Okay, so we know a bunch of stuff about Murray here. And our conclusion is really just that Murray can't be accepted for the position of executive administrator. That's the conclusion. That's it. The rest of this, it would be very common for somebody, if I said, what's the conclusion? They would read this whole thing to me. And it's actually not. It's only that Murray can't be the executive administrator. These other two things are facts. And in fact, if I look at these facts and I kind of combine them together, what is this telling me about Murray? What is all this telling me? Okay, he has an undergrad degree. That's necessary for appointment to the executive board. Okay, Murray has an undergrad degree, so it sounds like he could be on the executive board. Oh, wait, he has a felony conviction. So that means he can't be appointed to the board. So what all this boils down to, if I look at these premises and what they're really telling me, Murray can't be appointed to the executive board. That's the big thing I'm going to take away from the premises. So now notice that there's a shift here. So my premises tell me that Murray can't be appointed to the executive board. And then my conclusion is saying Murray can't be executive administrator. Is that the same thing? What does that mean? Executive administrator, is the executive administrator part of the administrative board or the executive board? Are they different? Are they the same? Are they different? I don't know. But in one case, we're talking, like, again, I don't need to be an expert in executive boards to take the LSAT and succeed. I just know that they're talking about one thing over here, executive board in the premise, and they're talking about something that appears different to me. An administrator is maybe part of the board, but it's not the whole board. Vice versa. The executive board is, and that sounds like it's going to be more than one person, a board. And again, this is, the LSAT doesn't expect you to have specialized knowledge, but they expect you to have common knowledge that someone, going for a graduate level degree would have. So knowing that a board is more than one person and an administrator is a single person, that's common knowledge, right? They would expect you to have. So there's a difference here. And if we get back to what the question's asking, if we get back to what the question stem said, now that we've boiled down the argument to its real, not just the core, but we've even boiled it down a little more, and we see that I have this idea in the premise, executive board, Murray can't be appointed to the executive board. I have this new idea in the conclusion, Murray can't be executive administrator. So it's asking me, the conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So how do I know for sure? Again, this is all about just questioning, wondering. How do I know for sure that if Murray can't be appointed to the executive board, how does that prove that he can't be an executive administrator? Well, one way to do it is to say, if I added a statement, if I added a premise to this argument that said, if Murray can't be on the executive board, then can't be executive administrator. Like, if I had a premise that explicitly said this in the argument, then I would be convinced. If I knew that if you can't be on the executive board, then you can't be the executive administrator, now we've got a convincing argument. Because I already know one of these things. I know Murray can't be on the executive board. So this statement, if I add it to the argument, would tell me that based on that premise, based on that fact, that he can't be the executive administrator. So this is another important step in the process. It's predicting an answer choice. So once you boil down an argument to these pieces, the argument core, what's the premise, what's the conclusion, and you notice if there's a shift from one idea in the premise to a different idea in the conclusion, then you want to take a moment to do what we've been doing all night, right? Can you debate that? Can you say, well, yeah, sure, I accept your premise, but that doesn't mean I accept your conclusion. I accept that interest is going to start to accrue. That doesn't mean that taking out a loan is a bad idea, because what if I pay it right back? Or understanding what additional statement you have to add to the argument, which is, that's another way to approach the gap, is to be able to say, oh, I know what this argument is assuming. What this argument hasn't told me that if you can't be on the executive board, then you can't be an executive administrator. But that's something that if I add it to this argument, then I actually do have a convincing argument. Then the conclusion is guaranteed. You've convinced me of your conclusion. And notice that only one of these answer choices actually does that. There's only one answer choice that links those two ideas. So I look at answer choice A. Anyone with a master's degree without a felony conviction is eligible for appointment to the executive board. Great. That's telling me something about executive board, but that's not telling me anything about executive administrator. That's out of here. I'm going to leave B because it is connecting executive board to executive administrator. Undergraduate degree is not necessary for acceptance to the position of executive administrator. Okay, so an undergraduate degree is not necessary. Well, we know Murray has an undergraduate degree, so I'm not really concerned about that. And again, that doesn't link the two ideas that I'm trying to link. That doesn't tell me how executive board is connected to executive administrator. If Murray didn't have a felony conviction, he would be accepted for the position of executive administrator. But okay, so maybe I would leave that, right? The felony charge on which Murray was convicted is relevant to the duties of the position of executive administrator. So maybe like A and C look out right away, look wrong to me right away. And I'm thinking about B, D, and E. And maybe D and E would be appealing, but if I remember what this argument is doing, what is this argument doing? What is the actual evidence? The evidence they've given me is that Murray can't be appointed to the executive board. And B is the one that directly adds that piece that tells me what the executive board has to do with being executive administrator. Hey, if you're eligible, you have to be eligible for the executive board to be accepted for position of executive administrator. At this point, if I wasn't sure, I would actually just pick B and go, because it's directly connecting those ideas. But if I was to dig in a little deeper, and if I was to look back at the whole question again, I could still see reasons why D and E are wrong. But, again, and you want to be sure. And I'll just kind of leave with this thought. A couple thoughts about how to practice this. So what you would want to be able to do, is if you were reviewing this question, if you were going back and going over this in detail on your own, you would want to be able to look at answer choice D and E and compare it to your understanding of the argument core and be able to articulate why they're wrong, right? Why is it that D doesn't get me from these premises to this conclusion? Why is it that D doesn't actually guarantee that my premises lead to my conclusion? Well, if he didn't have a felony conviction, he would be accepted as an executive administrator. That doesn't tell me why not being appointed doesn't tell me he can't be this. Just because it's relevant, but that doesn't tell me that because he can't be appointed to the board, he can't be administrator. So D and E don't actually get me all the way there, even though they sound like they're relevant. So one of the big takeaways here is noticing how if I do drill the argument down to these relevant parts and I see the parts that the argument are trying to connect, the concepts that the argument is trying to connect, I can look for an answer choice. For this particular type of question, I'm going to pay the most attention to answer choices that actually link those two things. And I'm more skeptical of answer choices that don't link them at all. All right. So the two things I'm going to leave you with, one is, some of this stuff is really hard to do in real time when you're working at full speed, when you're, trying to answer these questions in 1:30 or less, or even 2 minutes or less. Some of this can be hard to do. So part of what you want to do is, go ahead and practice doing these things at full speed if you want. But what's far more important is reviewing. So being able to look at a question and really pick it apart the way that we're doing now. And what a lot of people will do is they'll work on an LSAT question and then they'll check the answer. And if they got it wrong, they'll just look at the right answer and try to understand why the right answer is right. And just still in these very broad terms. What you always want to do is go back and, so first of all, if you find a question hard, try to figure it out yourself. Try to pick it apart the way that we're picking apart these questions tonight, and see if you can work through yourself what was difficult for you and why didn't it just all click for you the first time. Look for these connections, see if you actually are breaking down the argument into its parts. Look for these connections. What are the concepts that we're trying to connect? What's the evidence they're giving me, and does it or does it not actually fully support the conclusion? And then take your time looking through the answer choices. See if you can explain to yourself or your fish or your aunt or your grandmother, see if you can explain it to somebody who doesn't know anything about the LSAT. That's a really good test for your understanding. And then you got to practice. Like, you can't expect to just do this stuff automatically the first time you hear it. A lot of your success on the LSAT is going to be kind of wrapping your head around these concepts and then trying them out on other questions. Even if this is kind of, you're looking at this and going, okay, I think I get it, but I'm not really sure 100%. Just keep trying it. Practice with other questions the way we've done this tonight, and you'll start to see these connections. All right, so I did promise, we're right at the end of time right now, but I did promise that I would do some Q&A, so I am happy to stick around for another minute or so. If anybody has any questions right now that they want to ask, I can stick around for a minute or two and answer those. And if you have to take off, if you're leaving, then I will say thank you for being here. Check out our YouTube channel, like I said earlier, and you'll see more of these. We're going to do these twice a month. Another thing to keep in mind too is if you go to our website, if you're interested in how getting more practice with this stuff and how we do this, you can attend any of our online or in-person classes for free. So if you are interested, you can go to our website, and again, I'll put the link. There's a little commercial, right? We got to do a little commercial here. I'll put this link in the chat window, and it'll be, if you're watching the video, it should be in the details for the video. You can go there. You can check out our upcoming classes online and in person, and attend session 1 of our classes for free. And in session 1, we cover not just the logical reasoning section, but the logic game section as well. So that's it. That's all I got for you guys tonight. Thanks a lot for coming. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, maybe we'll see you here again next time. Okay, so we do have a couple questions in the Q&A window. So struggling in questions asking for the purpose of specific wordings. Sure. So yeah, like, what is the role played in the argument by the statement that, X, Y, Z? So what I'm going to suggest, first of all, is the first step is make sure you're clear on what we've talked about tonight in terms of the argument core. And how an argument works. Like I said, you can go back and watch the free prep hour we did on way off on the month, July 2nd. And we talk in more detail about exactly what you're talking about here, how to read one of these paragraphs and actually not just identify, oh yeah, that's the conclusion, these are premises, but what are all these other things they put in here too? So make sure you're clear on what background information means. What do we mean by an opposing point? Make sure you're clear on what an argument actually is and how these different statements in the argument are related to one another. And then when you see a question like that, your first step should be to go, don't worry about that little piece of the argument that they tell you, that little quote from the argument. Don't worry about that. As soon as you recognize that you're dealing with this type of question, go up and find the argument core. Break it down piece by piece, just like we were doing tonight. Look and identify, what is my conclusion? What are my premises? What about these other statements? Are they supporting the conclusion? Are they, are they premises, or are they irrelevant? Do they disagree with the conclusion? So see if you can identify each individual statement, and especially the role, identify the conclusion and identify the role that each statement plays in relation to the conclusion. If you can do that, then when you look at the answer choices, you'll find that some of them just don't describe at all what that quote does. So once you've identified the argument core and you've identified all these statements and what role they play, then you go look at that quote again and say, you should know by then what it was. You'll say, oh yeah, that was the conclusion. Let me find an answer choice that describes a conclusion. Oh, look, this answer choice says it's support for the conclusion. So I know the piece I'm looking for is the conclusion. So an answer choice that describes it as support for the conclusion can't be correct. Excuse me, but that's the basic process. Somebody else said, this is a great question. What is your advice for someone starting at square one in terms of test prep? If you guys stuck around for this, if you're watching on the YouTube channel and you stuck around for this question, I'm so glad you stuck around. The advice for someone starting at square one is take a practice test. That should be the first thing that you do if you are just preparing to start studying for the LSAT, if you're just starting to prep. I know a lot of people don't want to do it. A lot of people say, oh, I want to learn something first and then I'll take a practice test, but you're far better off, much better off. Go to the LSAC website or go to our website, manhattanprep.com. Go to our free resources. I mentioned that page earlier on. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see in the information below, you'll see a link to our free resources page. Download the June 2000s test and use our online proctor and just take the test as if you were taking it under real conditions. And then you'll see where you're scoring right now. And everybody starts at a different place. So without any prep at all, just based on your initial understanding or your existing understanding of these concepts, you'll get a certain score. Some people get a 120 on their first practice test. Some people get a 170. But you want to know where you are. Just that's where I am right now. It doesn't dictate what you'll eventually score, but you do want to know where you are right now. And then think about what your goal is. What law school are you trying to get into, and what LSAT score do you need to get into that law school? Don't just say, oh, I want to get as high of an LSAT score as possible. Well, yeah, so does everybody, right? What score do you need to get into the law school you want to attend? And once you know those two things, here's where I am and here's what I need, then you can make an effective plan and you can have a more effective idea of how long is this going to take me? Oh, look, I'm only 5 points away from my goal score. Okay. Or I'm 20 points away from my goal score. It doesn't mean I'll never reach my goal score, but I'm going to have to do some serious effort to get there. So that's always my first piece of advice is take a diagnostic test, take a practice test, see what your score is just without knowing anything about the LSAT, and then take it from there, make a plan from there. All right, folks, thank you all very much for coming. Excellent questions at the end. We will see you, hopefully we'll see you again for one of these. I'll be back here probably in a month or so doing another one. We'll have our instructors showing up every couple of weeks doing these free prep hours. So thanks for being here. Good luck and happy LSATing.